Hi, this is Pritesh from Racketline, the Racket Sports Specialist. We're here today to look at choosing a squash racket. Now, what are the things that we look at when we actually choose a squash racket? So if I had somebody who's new to the game or wants to improve in the game, they come in and they ask me that question. There's a few things that we're going to run through. The first is the shape of the head. So we call it the shape of the throat, the balance of the racket, the weight of the racket. Now the grip size doesn't matter too much, and there's also the beam thickness of the racket as well, and the stringing pattern. So we start by looking at the first few things on there. Now the shape of the throat is quite important when it comes to squash rackets. So I'm just going to pick up a couple of rackets here to illustrate the point. Now this racket has what we call an open throat. So we can see that the racket head shape extends almost all the way down to the handle, and this we call an open throat. Now this racket has what we call a closed throat, so the head shape doesn't sort of extend all the way down. It's a much smaller head shape. Now the difference between these two is that this one will generate a lot more power. So the longer we can make this main string, the more power that the racket will generate. So this racket, we would say, is more about generating power, and conversely this one, which has a much shorter main string and a much shorter string bed, means that it's more of a control racket. So this will probably be for more of the advanced players, and this will be more for somebody who's starting out, needs to generate more power as well. And the other thing that we looked at also is the beam thickness. Now generally beam thickness is run from 16 to 21 millimeters. So the thicker the beam thickness, if we look at this one, it's a lot thicker than this one. The thicker the beam thickness, the stiffer the racket becomes. So there again, that reflects in how much power we can generate with the racket. The thinner beam thicknesses are generally slightly more flexible, maybe generate a bit more power through being more flexible. Now we also looked at the weight of rackets, and the racket ranges in squash range all the way from 90 grams, which is an amazing weight, which is a racket that's produced by Yelex, all the way up to 160 grams, which would be classed as quite heavy. In general terms, at the moment the market sits somewhere around 125 to 130 grams, and that would cover quite a wide range of rackets. Now the weight is important because it determines the maneuverability of the racket. So the lighter the racket, the more maneuverable it becomes. The more racket head speed we can generate, the more power. But conversely, the argument also goes with a lot of coaches is the heavier the racket, the more plow through we get with the ball, and the more force we can generate behind there. So that again, I think, comes back to the preference of the player. So some players like heavier rackets to generate more power, and some people like more lighter rackets. So now we'll move on to talking about the balance of the racket. Now again, balance is another quite important feature, and we look at head heavy versus head light versus even balanced. And it's a sort of a general principle with racket sports. With the head heavier rackets, it's about getting the racket to sort of follow through more and generate a faster stroke. More head light rackets are developed sort of more faster recovery phase in playing, and in squash it will be those sort of shots where you just aim it at the tin and try and catch your opponent out, and then moving all the way to sort of more even balance, which means you can do a bit of everything then. We talked about the grip. Now sort of squash is slightly unusual in the fact that all the grip sizes are the same, so it's one thing we don't really have to worry about when we're talking to people when they're buying a new racket. The patterns, the stringing patterns can vary. We can have sort of more open patterns and somewhere around 12 by 12 strings, which from a stringing perspective are a dream to string, and from a playing perspective generate more power. So again, the more dense the pattern, so we can even move up to a 17 by 21 pattern, would mean that would be a more control racket, because literally it would take all the power out of the ball. The ball would be like hitting a brick wall. And then we can also look at types of string that we use as well in the racket. Now that can really affect how much power we generate or the sort of dynamics we want to see in the racket. Now we've got a couple of very popular strings. We've got fantastic Ashaway string there. which is using the ZX technology that Ashway also used, the Zymax technology which they use in the badminton strings. And this has proved to be a very popular string, really good feel, good power, and the other fantastic thing, very good durability on the ZX. And then there's also the other market leaders, which are Technifiber, who have the really fantastic traditional string called 305 Plus Green, which is really big favorite with seasoned players. We've even got t-shirts which say I play with green. And then we've got the new Technifiber string called DNA Max, which is sort of relatively new and has the PU coating inside and outside of the string, which again generates more power. So I'm just going to talk about one of the sort of latest and major innovations in squash rackets. Is around, we spoke earlier about having a larger main string to generate more power. The manufacturers have brought out technology which we call a power bridge. Now the idea there is that we wrap the main string all the way around the power bridge and back up, so we end up with the main string which is twice as long. Now there's an example there with Technifiber, and we've got with one with Prince as well, who also use the power bridge technology quite a lot. So that's quite an interesting feature, and it shows how the manufacturers are really, within the space that they've got in the racket, innovate to generate more power. So again, if we're looking for a squash racket, the points that we'd cover would be the head shape, so we've got open throat and closed throat. The weight of the racket, again we said between 110 to 160 grams. The balance of the racket, head light, medium or head heavy, or balanced I should say. And then in terms of the beam thickness, that determines the thickness of the stiffness of the racket. And then finally moving on to the stringing pattern. And again, with our stringing service, we can look at the types of strings you use, try and get different properties in the string. So those are the sort of main points we look at when we're looking to buy a squash racket. But there again, we're always here to help you at Racketline.